of Lya Frank's talk. We're going to be starting in just a little bit. We're just going to wait for a few people to join in. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today, and I want to remind you again, we will be having survivor talks in the next couple of weeks, as well as other programs. If you have any questions for Lya while she's speaking, you can type them into the comment box and we'll be able to answer some of them after her talk. Again, I want to thank everybody for joining, and we'll get started in a bit. So welcome, Lya Frank. Lya is a Holocaust survivor from the Netherlands, and she will be sharing her story with you. And thank you so much, Lya, for speaking, and we can start now.
We're live now, so good morning, everybody, and welcome to my video talk. I've never done this before, so we're muddled through it all together with the help of Michael. My name is Lya Frank. I was born in the Netherlands on April 17th, 1936. I had a very traditional family. I had a mother, a father, two grandmothers, a grandfather, lots of uncles, aunts, cousins, and other relatives. On April 17, 1939, which was my third birthday, I received the best present anyone can ever wish for. I received a little sister. So we share the same birthday, and we've all our lives we've been very close. So in 1940, May 10th, 1940, the war started, and Holland was the Netherlands. Now they used to call it Holland. The Netherlands were invaded by the Germans, totally unexpected. Holland had wanted to remain neutral, like they had in World War I, but the Germans invaded, so Holland was not prepared at all. They put up a valiant fight for about 3 days, and the fourth day, the Germans got tired of whatever resistance the Dutch put up, and they decided to bomb the port or the harbor of Holland, which was Rotterdam. Now, Rotterdam's port was one of the main ports in Western Europe. So they aimed for the port, but instead of the port, they unloaded their bombs on the inner city of Rotterdam. They completely missed the port. So hundreds of people were killed. Thousands of people were maimed and lost their homes and had to flee the city. And from then on, those people were called or were named the evacuees from Rotterdam. And the reason I'm telling you that is because that came to be an important factor in my life later on. So the Germans invaded Holland. Our government fled. The Queen fled to London and tried to do her stuff from London. But we were totally under German regime. And the Germans were very smart. They didn't change the way of life immediately. They made some subtle changes. And the Dutch were kind of lulled into being complacent. And they said, well, if that is the worst we have to do, it's not so bad. But as time went on, the laws and the rules became stricter and stricter. And there came a time where everyone had to register in City Hall, including all the citizens, including, of course, all the Jews. And the Jews when they were registered, they got a big J on their registration paper. So as time went on, the rules became stricter and stricter until they started basically all against the Jewish population. So from 1941 on, we were not allowed to go to school, the Jews, that is. We were not allowed to go to school. We were not allowed to go to the park. We were not allowed to go to the theater. We were not allowed to visit regular stores only at certain hours. We were not allowed to, Jewish employees were fired. No Jewish professors, no Jewish teachers, no Jewish CEOs, anything. Everybody was arbitrarily let go. In 1941, in retaliation for something that somebody had done against the German, either spoken against Hitler, the first raid, which is arbitrarily taking people off the street, Jews, and sending them to concentration camp. The first raid took place, I believe it was February of 1941, so that was less than 1 year after the war started. People were, young Jewish men were picked up from wherever they were, or whether they were still at work or just at home. They were sent to Mauthausen, never to be heard from again. I have an aunt who just reached, she's going to be 101 this year, and she was married to my mother's brother. They were married in December of 1940. In June of 1941, they were walking on the street. There was a second raid. He was ripped away from her arm, sent to Mauthausen, and never to be heard from again. So this aunt was married to my uncle. So my grandmother was her mother-in-law. My grandmother had 3 children, 3 offsprings, let's put it that way. My mother, a sister to my mother, and a brother to my mother. So she had 2 girls, 1 boy. My aunt was also married in, and she was living in Amsterdam. And Amsterdam, of course, was the first place where all the Jews were persecuted, and because the majority of Jews lived in Amsterdam, and I was born in Utrecht, so we were still relatively quiet. So in Amsterdam, they made all the Jews move to a certain area, which they then called a ghetto. The reason being that it would be much easier to pick up the Jews to send them to concentration camps if they were congregated in one specific place, which is exactly what happened. The Jews were picked up from that place, from that area, sent to what they called the Hollandse Schouwburg, which was a theater, which was kind of like a holding place. And from there, they were sent on the train to Westerbork, which was a transit camp. And from there, they were then sent on to Auschwitz, Birkenau, Bergen-Belsen, Theresienstadt, Terezin, they call it. We lived in Utrecht, which is more of an outlying area. And when the Germans were done with Amsterdam, which was the beginning of 1943, Amsterdam was what they call Judenfrei, free of Jews, other than the ones that had been able to get away, maybe to Switzerland, maybe to England, but or maybe going to hiding, and I'll get to that in a little bit. So from then on, it was the hunt for Jews was more concentrated on outlying area. So on April 17th, 1943, my sister Ellie and I celebrated our birthdays. And that was at the same time the last full day I ever saw my parents alive. On April 18th, 1943, the two of us were put on the back of two bicycles of good friends of my parents, Gentile friends of my parents, whom we knew as an uncle and aunt, who we were little girls, 7 and 4. So we were put on the back of their bicycles and taken to our first transit home to be put into hiding at a few days later. Was it traumatic for us? I don't remember, because we were very familiar with these people and we were told that we would be going away for a few days and we would see our parents again. So it was maybe more like an adventure. So Ellie and I were put into this transit home, and from there, a resistance organization, which consisted of mostly students, found us more permanent homes to stay at, people that were willing to hide Jewish children. Now, for Ellie, it was more difficult to find a place because she was dark-haired, had dark eyes, had the Semitic look. They found her a place on a farm away from public eye, totally. And she was there for about 6 months, and then it became too dangerous, and she was transferred to a farm across the way. The farmers' wives were sisters, and she stayed there for another 2 years. So she was completely away from the public eye. It was across a water, and if anybody wanted to visit the farm, they had to ring a bell and somebody would come and get them with a little boat. I, on the contrary, was blonde and had blue eyes or light eyes, which is what the whole population of Holland was, blonde and blue-eyed. Remember, this was in the 40s. This was before all the borders opened, all the colonies were no longer in existence, and everybody immigrated to the Netherlands. So for me, it must have been a little easier to find a place to hide. So I landed with a doctor's family in Amserfoort. Amserfoort is maybe 20, 30 kilometers from Utrecht. And I'm just trying to think. I ended up with that family. He was an ophthalmologist. His wife was the medical assistant in the practice, and the practice was at home. Like they have many practices at home still in Europe, the medical practice. So these people had two little girls. One was 6 and one was 4. And the first night I ended up there, they were very kind people, very nice people. They had a big home because, like I say, the medical practice was right there on the premises. So all the rooms were up, all the bedrooms, etc., was upstairs. So the first night they put me to bed, and they said, "Don't worry, we'll take good care of you. You'll be safe." And of course, I started to cry, and they said, "Why are you crying?" And I said, "I don't really want to sleep alone. I don't want to sleep alone. I want to sleep with my sister." because remember, she was born on my birthday and we had always shared a room. So the next day, they transferred my bed. They said, well, not tonight, but tomorrow we'll transfer you over to the girls' room. And for the next more than 2 years, the three of us shared one room, and we got along very well. I was the oldest by a year and probably the bossiest, and they were not so bossy, so we got along pretty well. Very well, actually. I'm still in very close contact with them. We are now, all three of us are widowed, and we're all grandmothers, etc., etc. And our relationship goes on to already the fourth generation. My grandchildren know their grandchildren, which would be the great grandchildren of the original hiding parents. So whenever I go to Holland, I visit with them. We WhatsApp, we Skype, etc., etc. So I stayed there for about a little bit more than 2 years. And we were not allowed to go downstairs, of course, because that's where the patients were, and I was not to be seen, even though I fit right in. They were blonde and I was blonde, but people knew they had 2 children. So we were not allowed to go downstairs, other than maybe if the weather permitted to go into the yard for a while. In the very beginning, I was allowed to go on the street with the hiding mother and the 2 girls until word came back that someone from my city, remember it was not that far away, someone from Utrecht had recognized me on the street, and no one was supposed to know where I was. So he had recognized me on the street, and word came back that I should not be seen on the street because now they knew where I was. And if this went to the wrong people, then they had an idea where I was. So I was not allowed on the street for about 2 years. And this family had a housekeeper who had been there for several generations. But since she was not allowed to go home over the weekends anymore, no travel was allowed from one province to the next, she had to give up her job and they had to hire another housekeeper because both parents were not available to us little girls. So they hired a new housekeeper who was young, and whether she had an inkling or whether she was just nasty, she cornered me one day and she started to interrogate me. I must have been about 8 years old. And she cornered me when I was somewhere alone. And she said, I don't understand. How come your parents never call? How come your parents never come to see you? How come they don't write a letter? How come this? How come that? And I said, I don't know. I don't know where they are. I am an evacuee from Rotterdam. That's the city that was bombed, and I'm a refugee from Rotterdam, and I don't know where they are. So she wasn't very happy with that. I had the feeling she would rile into me another time, but I told my hiding parents, whom I called uncle and aunt at that time, and I told them in the evening what had happened. And of course, they had to give her notice, couldn't take a chance that she would catch me another time and I might give the wrong information. But in the meantime, they were very proud of me, very happy that I had not given anything away. And I got the only candy that was available during the war because we did not have any candies. So after that, I believe we did without a housekeeper. But we were also getting a little bit older. So May 5th, 1945, the tanks rolled in. We had a lot of bombs falling on the city, and we had to hide in the shelter. And that was completely equipped with blankets and whatever food there was available. And a couple of times we really had to go into the shelter, but it was on the premises. May 5th, 1945 rolled around, and the tanks and the trucks and the jeeps rolled in. Canadians, Americans, British. And what did we get? Everybody was allowed to go outside, and the flags came out. It was liberation. And we girls were allowed to go outside on the street. And what did we get? We got white bread, which nowadays nobody wants to eat anymore because it's not healthy. But for us, it was wonderful. It was like cake. We got chocolate. We got some chewing gum. And we got some cigarettes for my hiding father, who was a smoker, unfortunately. And everybody was super happy. Until a few days later, I thought, well, now I'll just wait for my parents to come and get me, and we can go home. Well, that did not happen. A few months later, one of my uncles showed up. My father had 3 brothers and a sister and a mother before the war. So my one uncle, Uncle Alex, showed up, Uncle Lex. And I don't remember, I never knew, I never asked him how he located me, but he did, and he asked permission to take me to see my sister. Now, I hadn't seen my sister in almost 2.5 years. And so how we got to the farm, I don't remember, because there was no public transportation. Maybe there was somebody with a car. I don't really remember. So I got to the farm, and I didn't recognize my own sister. She was 4 when she left, 4 in one day. And now she was almost 6.5. And, people, especially children, change a lot in 2.5 years. So I said, I must have said, according to her hiding mother, is that my little sister? And I didn't recognize her. But after about an hour, we were close, and, we got to talk, and she was totally different than when we left each other. And we got very close that day. And then I had to go back to Amserfoort. And I said, I don't want to go back. I want to stay with my sister, because when am I going to see her again? So I had to go back, and arrangements were made that I could stay with Ellie's hiding family, the farmers, and they were pretty poor. And they had a bunch of children already, but arrangements were made that I would be transferred over to her hiding people until our parents showed up. So my hiding parents allowed me to be transferred. So I lived with that family for maybe 6 months. And we kept asking, when are mom and dad coming back? When are they coming to get us? Nobody knew anything. Until one day we were playing outside, and her hiding mother, whom we called Tante Cor, called us inside into the fancy room, the front room. Now, these were super religious Dutch Reform Christian people, super religious, wonderful people. And the front room was only used on Sundays or holidays. And there was an organ there, and you could play the organ if that's what you wanted to do. And otherwise, you could read there, read the Bible, or read a book, or have a board game. remember, there was no radio, no television, no iPhone, no computer, nothing. So she called us in to she said, girls, come on in, I want to speak with you. So we went into the front room and I thought, there's something not quite correct here. There's something not right. We have to go into the front room and it's not Sunday. So that is when she told us that our parents had gone, in her words, our parents had gone to heaven. Well, heaven to me didn't mean anything. All I knew is that they weren't coming back. But to my sister, she had been in this religious family for 2.5 years. Heaven was maybe different than it was for me. She was also 3 years younger. So I cried for a bit. I don't remember if she cried, if she really realized what was going on. So then I thought to myself, now what are we going to do? By that time, I was on parents number 3. And I was 9 years old. So I thought, now what are we going to do? So it turns out that we didn't know that at the time, that our parents had gone into hiding together with my paternal grandmother and her 2 unmarried sons and unmarried daughters, and my parents and a cousin. And they had gone into hiding in my father's birthplace, meaning it was a little village where my family had lived for centuries. Yeah, maybe a century. Everybody knew my family. My grandmother was a widow, and they called her the Widow Myers, and she had a little store, and she supplied the farmers with their outfits and their boots and their underwear, the long johns and clothing. Everybody knew them there. So 7 of my relatives went into hiding, spread over 2 different homes in the village where my father was born, where my grandmother was born, where my great-grandmother was born. Nothing would have happened. They were all right there, except that there was a stepdaughter to one of the 2 families who had a romantic relationship with a Nazi officer, and she denounced or betrayed my whole family. So they were betrayed. They were sent on the bus. A bus came to get them. They were sent to Westerbork, and from there they all ended up in, Auschwitz, Birkenau. I don't know exactly where some of them ended up. And the only one that survived was my cousin, first cousin. So I did not know that at the time in 1945, and nobody ever told us about that until way, way later. So when Ellie's hiding mother told her that he had gone to heaven, I thought, now what are we going to do? Well, it turns out that the only survivor of my whole family, Ellie and I, survived from our immediate family. And from the whole family, only one uncle survived with his wife, a brother to my father, same last name, and their daughter, who had also been in hiding, separate from them. So in November 1945, my uncle and his wife, my other phone is ringing, so anyway, sorry about that. He and his wife, who was my aunt then, decided that they would become our guardians. Adoption was not allowed, I found out later. because on the far out chance that maybe one of our parents would still be alive and be found somewhere. Adoption was not allowed for any of the orphan children that were left after the war. So they had a very difficult time finding housing because they had been in hiding in a stable for 3 years, almost 3 years. And in the meantime, 2 weeks after the war, they had another daughter who was born in the stable. So she was born May 19th, 1945. So my aunt, who was a young woman, was now left also without parents, without any close relatives. And all of a sudden, she not only had 2 girls, because her oldest daughter survived in hiding, separate from them. And they had that little girl in 1945, but then they decided to become our guardians. So now my aunt had 4 girls. So by the time they found a home in Amsterdam, housing was not to be found. Nobody could find any housing. It was the end of 1945, and we all moved in together. Now, I must say, it was a wonderful thing that my uncle and aunt became our guardians, but my aunt really was not totally mentally stable enough to handle this situation. She came out of the Holocaust as a very traumatized person, and she might have been somewhat unbalanced to begin with. So I was now on parents number 4, and it was not an easy time for any of us, but I was the oldest, so she and I just didn't see eye to eye in many things. I did not want to be treated like a small child anymore. I had too many experiences, and she had her own issues, and as did I. But she was a very smart woman, and she found out that there was an opportunity for children that had gone through the war and had been hungry and lost their parents, that there was an opportunity to go to Denmark for recuperation, and that there were people in Denmark that had agreed to take in a child. I don't remember if it was just for Jewish children, but I am assuming it was, because the non-Jewish children mostly had their own parents still. So off we went to Denmark. It must have been beginning of 1946. We went to Denmark to recuperate from our experiences, and the trip was to last for 1 month. And when we got to the arrival hall in Copenhagen, and they started calling out our names, again, we would be separated. So both of us started crying. And then there was a couple who said, we'll take 2 girls. And they took us in. They had a beautiful home. And instead of 1 month, they kept us there first for 3 months, and they prolonged it again. In the end, we stayed there for 9 months. We really didn't want to go back to Holland because Denmark was so much better. And that was parents number 5 for me. But they were wonderful, and there was food, and there was clothing, and there had not been that much suffering. But in the end, we had to go back to Holland, which is when my after-war life really started. So my uncle insisted that we all go to Jewish day school. I started 4th grade. I'd never been to school before. My sister and my cousin sister started 1st grade and 2nd grade. And that was in 4th grade. Actually, all the children in that school had gone through trauma, because we were all survivors. Some were orphans, some had a mother, some had a father, some lived with their aunt, etc., etc. And the story I always say is that I also went to a Jewish high school. I was with some of these students, I was together for about 8 years, 3 years in elementary, 5 years in high school. I know nothing about anybody's life prior to having met them in school. Nobody ever talked about it. We wanted to be normal. We wanted to have a normal life. And nobody asked us. And hidden children were always kind of belittled. Well, you didn't experience as much. You weren't in a camp. You had a good home. Some of us had not such good homes, but Ellie and I were very fortunate. We had wonderful homes during the war. But everybody forgot that we had so many different sets of parents, and that we had our own experience. Well, anyway, I went through elementary school for 3 years, and I had the most wonderful teacher who was also a survivor, very, very strict. He got me ready for high school, which was a very challenging high school. And I got through high school in 5 years, which was the shortest time you could get through it. And all the while, my home life was very, very stressful. My aunt and myself, we didn't see eye to eye. She wouldn't acknowledge that I had experienced, and I put on a good face for the outside world and went on. In 1954, I graduated. I went to work. I didn't want to go on studying anymore. I went to work for a few years. Still lived at home, of course, because there was no housing anyway, and that is the European way. In 1957, my uncle decided, 1956, the Hungarian Revolution started. My uncle said, "We're out of here. We're going to the United States. I don't want to experience anything like this anymore. We're out of here." So as a family, in the meantime, they had one son, which was my aunt's ultimate wish, to have one son and not 4 girls. They had a son in 1949. So in 1957, the whole family immigrated to the United States, straight to California. And we landed in Los Angeles. The aunt that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, that had been married to my uncle who never returned from Mauthausen. She had, in the meantime, remarried. She was a young woman. She was 24 when she remarried after the war. She and her new husband and her family had immigrated to the United States. They were in Chicago. They put up a bond for 7 people, which was, in those days, you had to put up an affidavit. They put up that bond. So we landed in Los Angeles in May of 1957. We all got a job within 2 weeks, meaning my uncle, their oldest daughter, who was 16, my sister, who was, she was 17, my Ellie, who was 18, and myself, I was 21. We all got a job within 2 weeks, actually. And we moved first to Glendale, then we moved to West Hollywood, near the Fairfax area. And one after the other got married. I got married in 1959, December of 1959, also to a Holocaust survivor from Austria who was older than I. than I am. He was older than I was, and still would be older than I am now. And he had been in the resistance. As a Jew, he had been in the resistance, but was also betrayed and ended up in Bergen-Belsen. We got married in 19... I didn't know any of this when I met him, but he heard us speak Dutch, and he had been in Holland. He escaped Austria to try and get away from Hitler, and ended up in Holland and went in the resistance, and that's a different story. So, but he heard us speak Dutch, and that right away attracted him to all of us. And ultimately, he and I got married in 1959. We have a daughter who was born in 1962. And we were married 54 and a half years until he passed away almost 6 years ago while we were on vacation. And of all places, he passed away in Germany, which was another trauma. But so now I have my daughter left, my son-in-law, and 2 grandchildren. And I make it a point to let young people know that, yes, even children that were hidden do have a story to tell. Ultimately, I want to leave the audience with this. The student organization was the one that ultimately found many of us a place to hide. These were students that were 18, 19, 20, 21 years old. Why did they go into resistance? Because they did not have a husband, a wife, children that they needed to protect. So if they were executed, it would just be them. They were very active. There was a student organization in Utrecht, where I lived. There was one in Amsterdam, and they did a lot of good work. And then when I speak to my students, I always say, you never know when will be the last day you see your parents. It can be peacetime, it can be wartime, it can be an accident. Try and be kind to them, because you never know when will be the last time you see them. And the one I ultimately missed the most was my grandmother. She and I had a very special, my maternal grandmother, she and I had a very special relationship. She taught me how to read, to write. And I thought if anybody would have come back, I would have wanted to be my grandmother. But lucky for her, she did not survive, because all 3 of her children and many of her grandchildren did not survive. So I don't know how she would have dealt with that. Anyway, thank you all for listening, and I wish you a good day. And please be mindful and try and be kind to each other, because we don't know what the next step is going to be. Thank you. And I guess Michael will have questions if there are any questions.
Thank
Michael,
you.
it's exactly 11:45.
Wonderful timing. Thank you so much, Lya, again, for sharing your story. We do have a few questions from the audience. The first question is, what is your most precious memory?
My most precious memory of my life?
Yeah.
I think my most vivid memories are the time I spent with my grandmother. She came over to, when I was, before I was 7, she came over to our house. She didn't live with us, but she came over to our house, and she was very instrumental in my, I don't know if I can say who I am today, because she was really, truly a very gifted, wonderful person. But she taught me how to read and to write and to do what we called arithmetic. Now it's called math. And I have very vivid memories of her spending a lot of time with me.
And Since you were so young when this was happening, at first, were you aware of the reasons? And do you remember if how specifically the adults around you tried to explain things to you?
No, I don't remember anybody explaining anything to me. Remember, I was barely 7, and it's not like 2020 where 2-year-olds know how to play the computer and know what cereal they want and have a say in everything. We were really children, and I believe that our parents were trying to shield us from all this mass madness. I do not remember. I do remember that my mother and my grandmother were sewing the yellow stars on the clothing, but that really didn't mean that much to me because I didn't know why. So that's all I can tell you. Are there any further questions?
And yes, I know that you mentioned during your talk about how you kept in touch with the family who hid you, but I was wondering if you can just talk about that a little bit more, how you kept in touch with them over the years and how often you visited them, if they come to visit you in California.
While I was still in Holland, of course, I kept in touch by writing letters because from 1945 until early 50s, there were not even telephones available to anybody. So I wrote letters and I always thanked him. And I know that my uncle sent them a long letter thanking them for saving my life and having been good to me. And I used to visit them once, like over a weekend or so. And when I uh, became older, and here in the United States, we've always kept in touch. And the first time we went back to Holland, which was 1970, and I had immigrated in 57, and I wanted Terry, my daughter, to know where we came from, and it was my hiding parents who they were at that time living in a retirement home, and they had rented a facility for us where we could stay, and from there we could visit other people. But the first people we visited was them, and they met Terry when she was a little girl, and we celebrated birthday together with their daughters and their children. And from then on, Henk and I, my husband and I, went to Holland since the late 70s, almost every year. And we always spent a day with the two girls and their husbands and their children when they were little and then not so little. And now I talk to them regularly on WhatsApp and I visit them, and we're all becoming a little crotchety and we all have our issues, but we are in very close contacts. Of course, the hiding parents themselves have passed away a long time ago. And they all visited me here, including some of the grandchildren.
You mentioned something important at the end. You said that everyone who survived has a story, even those who were hidden. Can you talk about how you started sharing your story with people, and how you came to realize that you had an important story to share with the world?
I never talked about my past in the very beginning. Like I said, in school, we never talked because we all had a story and we didn't want to be any different from anybody else. When I immigrated to the United States, of course, that became a little bit of the back burner because we had to try and make a living and build up a new life, and nobody here was that familiar with the Holocaust, so that became on the back burner. And it wasn't really until I had a couple of other major issues, which was the straw that broke the camel's back. And that was in 1992, 93. And with a lot of help, I got over my issues, and not over them, but they helped me with my problems. And that is when I owned up to having a story to tell. And that's when it was an encouragement for me to start talking and sharing my story, even though many people said survivors, other survivors, that said children don't have memories and don't realize what happened and don't really have a story to tell or didn't suffer enough or whatever. And so it was not until 1993 that I started opening up a little bit. And then I was encouraged to speak for the museum and stuff like that, schools. And now I'm just doing it by request.
Now, the last question, how do you think your experiences during the Holocaust affected you and shaped your life?
That's a difficult question because I don't really know what I was like before the Holocaust. I was 7 and I was a little girl, but you have your habits, you have your nice things, not nice things, you have your personality. All I know that after the war, I became a very aggressive, not physically aggressive, but very belligerent, very angry, and I showed that in not too many good ways. For instance, when I was in high school already, and high school was different than it is today, but you don't contradict the teacher, but I did all the time. And so I was sent out to spend time in the hallways. I mean, I've never been to school in the United States, so I don't know how it goes here. But I would spend more time in the hallway than I sometimes spent in the classroom. And my aunt's brother-in-law, my aunt that raised me then after the war, her brother-in-law, he and his wife and her sister, he was married to her sister. And the two sisters did not really get along, but they tolerated each other. But it wasn't like Ellie and I that we really were very close. But her brother-in-law was the principal of the school, so he knew me from other settings, from coming to our house sometimes. And he would always say, Lya, 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 what did you do now? What did you say now? So I became very aggressive and very angry, and I wouldn't take anybody's word for anything that I knew to be different. But over the years, I've been taught to temper that. So I am now, let's say, assertive, but no longer aggressive. So that probably changed my personality. And now I'm thinking again. So
Now, see that? That's it for the questions. I know that we can't hear the audience right now. However, I would like to ask the audience to join me in saying a happy early birthday to Lya and her sister, Ellie.
that's right.
Happy birthday, Lya and Ellie.
Thank you.
Thank you again so much, Lya, for sharing your story. We're so honored to have you here and to learn this important story. Before we sign off, I just want to let you know that while the museum is closed, we will be regularly providing virtual programs like this one this Friday April 17th at 11 o'clock Pacific time. Dr. Stephen Stach, a historian from the Polin Museum, the history of Polish Jews, will give a talk entitled Better to Die with a Gun in the Hands, History and Memory of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. That's Dr. Stefan Stach. And this Sunday, April 19th at 2 o'clock Pacific time, please join us for our annual Yom HaShoah commemoration, which will be streamed here live on Facebook. And you can find more information about these events and all future programs on the museum's Facebook page or on our website, www.lamoth.org. We thank everybody so much for your attention, and thank you again, Lya, for sharing your story.
You're welcome, Michael, and everybody have a good day. Stay safe, please.
Thank you.
Sign off.